Hello, today we're going to be talking about the circulatory system or the cardiovascular system. You can see that the circulatory system provides a way for the blood to be transported throughout the body. This is going to provide nutrients to the cells and allow the waste to be removed. It is a closed circulatory system, so that means that there's a heart, we have blood vessels, and blood. And as you can see here through the diagram, we're going to be learning about all the different parts of the heart. We're going to learn about the different arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins. Well, let's start with the heart. The heart is a cone-shaped organ. It's a hollow muscular pump about the size of your fist. Now, the pointed end is called the apex, and that is orientated to the left of the heart. In a lifetime, the heart will beat about 2.5 billion times and pump about 200 million liters of blood. This is more than 50 million gallons. And as it is, every minute, the heart recirculates the entire volume of blood in the body, and that is approximately 5 liters. Now, the heart is located right in the middle of our body. It is located behind the sternum in the mediastinum. So the pericardium is a sac that surrounds the heart. It's tough, it's loose fitting, it's inextensible. It is going to provide protection. It also is filled with about 10 to 20 milliliters of pericardial fluid, which is going to act as a lubricant during heartbeats. Now there's two different layers. There's the visceral pericardium and the parietal pericardium. The visceral pericardium covers the outer surface of the heart, and the parietal pericardium lines the inner surface of the pericardial cavity. And you can see here the sac, pericardial sac, and you can see the two layers, the parietal and the visceral layers. And again, this is for protection and lubricant. Myocardium is the typical heart muscle tissue. This is the major portion of the heart, and it consists largely of the cardiac tissue. The main function is that it's going to receive oxygen and nutrients from the coronary arteries, not from the blood that it pumps. And in the myocardium, the muscle fibers are very branched and tightly joined together, and that's where we get that intercalated discs that we had learned about. You can see there about the myocardium, that is the main muscle portion of the heart. Again, this is just another cross section showing you the myocardium and then the endocardium, which is what we're going to learn next. So the endocardium is the inner surface of the heart. It is a membrane composed of connective tissue and endothelial tissue. And it does lie continuous with the endothelial lining of the blood vessels. And then this is just showing you again the pericardial cavity when you have your visceral pericardium, parietal pericardium, you have your myocardium, and then the endocardium. So now we're going to start learning about the parts of the heart. There are 4 cavities divided into the right and left chambers of a heart. The right and left side is separated by a structure called the septum, and we have 2 atria and 2 ventricles. So you have right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. And this is just showing you the internal of a heart. All right, so the atrium, these are chambers that receive blood returning from the heart. So they're receiving the blood from the veins. They are going to contract and relax to receive blood and then push it into the ventricles. The atrium does have very thin walls compared to the ventricle. The right atrium and the left atrium are a little different because of the type of blood that they have. The right atrium is going to receive deoxygenated blood from the vena cava, And then the left atrium is going to receive the oxygenated blood from the lungs, from the pulmonary artery. And we have this ear-like flap that protrudes from the atrium, and that's called an auricle. And you can just see here the right and the left atrium. Again, the walls were relatively thin. It's going to be receiving blood, and the right side has the deoxygenated blood, and the left side has the oxygenated. The ventricles are chambers that pump blood out of the heart. They push the blood into large networks of vessels, so they have much thicker walls. It's very much more powerful than the atria, especially the left ventricle. So again, the right and the left ventricle is divided by the septum. The right ventricle is going to receive blood from the right atrium, and it's going to pump it right into the lungs through the pulmonary artery. The left ventricle receives the blood from the left atrium, and it's going to pump the blood into the systemic circuit. This is where all the blood is going from our heart to the body. These walls, again, in the left ventricle are thicker because it's harder to pump blood to the entire body than just to the lungs, as the right ventricle does. We have a couple more parts of the heart to talk about. The coronary sulcus is a deep groove that marks the border between the atria and the ventricles. The interventricular sulci are shallow grooves between the ventricles. This is a very fatty part of the heart, and the fat is needed to supply the heart with some energy. That sulci also contains veins and arteries that are going to supply the cardiac muscle of the heart itself. The intraventricular septum is the wall that separates the right and the left ventricles. And then the trabeculae carneae they're kind of like irregular bands of heart muscle. They are going to project into the inner surface of the ventricles. They're kind of like crossbars of flesh. They run along the ventricular walls. They kind of allow for blood to kind of get through there. And you can see there all of the different parts. You can see the trabeculae carneae. You can see the ventricles. You can see the fatty portion of the sulci. Now, we are going to now talk about the different valves of the heart. This is very important because we want to permit the flow of blood in only one direction. It's not a two-way flow. And we have two main types of valves. We have the atrioventricular valves, the AV valves, which are further divided into the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve. And then we have the semilunar valves, which are further divided into the pulmonary semilunar valves and aortic semilunar valves. So the AV valves, these valves prevent blood from flowing back into the atria from the ventricles once that ventricle contracts. It is going to lie right between the atrium and the ventricles, and it does have support from the chordae tendineae. Now, these are strong, fibrous muscle projections, again, that are going to help with the structure and support of the valves. The tricuspid valve is the right AV valve, and this is going to lie between the right atrium and the right ventricle. Now, it's called tricuspid because it has three cusps or flats. The bicuspid valve only has two cusps, and this is going to lie between the left atrium and the left ventricle. This is often called the left AV valve or the mitral valve. And when closing, the mitral valve closes very slightly before the tricuspid valve. You can see here how you can see the flaps. We have or cusps. Tricuspid has three, and the bicuspid has two. The semilunar valves are going to prevent blood from flowing back into the ventricles from the aorta and the pulmonary artery. It's called semilunar because the flaps resemble half moons. There are two types, the pulmonary and the aortic. A pulmonary semilunar valve is a valve at the entrance of the pulmonary artery. So it's going to lie right between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery. The aortic semilunar valve is the valve at the entrance of the aorta. This is going to close slightly before the pulmonary semilunar valve, and it does lie between the left ventricle and the aorta. And you could kind of see the positioning of those two semilunar valves. And again, they kind of look like half moons. So again, this is kind of showing you the different valves. All right, so now we're going to talk about the different blood vessels. We're going to first start off talking with arteries. Arteries is A for away, because the arteries carry blood away from the heart to the organs throughout the body. They're pretty large in diameter, and they have complex walls that contain concentric rings of elastic fibers. And this is important because when blood is pumped out of the heart, the walls of the arteries are pushed outward, increasing their fluid capacity. As their walls stretch, the rings of this elastic fibers recoil and then exert pressure against the blood in the arteries. And that's kind of what we're going to measure as our blood pressure. The aorta is the major artery that leads from the heart that supplies the blood to the body. Pulmonary arteries are the arteries that carry blood to the lungs from the heart. And then we have arterioles. These are the small arteries. Arterioles branch into smaller vessels, and these walls lack elastic fibers, but they have a lot of smooth muscle cells. So you can see there the arteries, the different layers. You can see all of the arteries and arterioles that are in the human body. You can see that the artery connects to the arteriole, which then connects to the capillary network, and then the venules and the veins. And we're going to learn about those just in a minute. So capillaries form the microscopic network of vessels that infiltrate every tissue, every cell. These are small, the shortest, they're the most porous channels of the vascular system. And their space, their lumen, is just large enough so that a red blood cell moves along in a single file. It's very important to note that chemicals are exchanged between the blood and the intercellular fluid surrounding these cells. So water, nutrients, waste products, dissolved gases, red blood cells and proteins are too large to penetrate these pores, but it's just the water, nutrients, waste, and the dissolved gases will go. You can see there all the different capillaries. Again, its size is just big enough so red blood cells go in a single file fashion. So veins are downstream from the capillaries, okay? First connects with the venule, which is the small vein, receives blood from the capillaries, all right? And then it connects to the veins. Now, these are the blood vessels that return blood to the heart. They're thin-walled. They allow a lot of pooling of blood during periods of inactivity. But skeletal muscular activity combined with the pressure in breathing is going to help squeeze the veins and force their contents to travel to the heart. Again, the flow of blood is maintained by one-way flaps, or the valves that project from those vessels. Blood pressure is very low here. And again, that's why we measure the blood pressure through our arteries. So the flow of blood through a heart. The basic way goes from the right atrium, right ventricle, the lungs, left atrium, left ventricle to the body. The blood enters into the right atrium through the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. And that carries deoxygenated blood high in carbon dioxide and puts it right into the right atrium. The right atrium is going to send the blood through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle. The right ventricle then is going to send the blood through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary artery to the lungs, and that's where it's picking up oxygen. The pulmonary veins carry oxygen-rich blood back and empties it into the left atrium. That left atrium sends blood through the bicuspid valve to the left ventricle, and then the left ventricle sends the blood sends the blood through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta to the rest